All right, hi everybody, welcome. We're just going to give everybody just a moment to get in and get situated. All right, thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon. We appreciate that it is a Friday afternoon in July in the summertime. So we just want to thank you for being here with us. We are really, I have to say, there's such power in this virtual format, and while there's certainly the fact that we lose the ability to come together and see one another and exchange our personal stories in between meetings and in the hallway, I do have to say that I'm really struck by the power of the commitment of our patient community as we've been in our breakouts and our networking sessions, and realizing how people are calling from our busy homes with our children in the background or from our desks in our offices to really learn about the legislation that we're taking to the Hill and the issues that are of importance to all of us. Some people are calling from medical appointments and infusion centers. A couple of people yesterday, one of my breakouts, were calling from their kids' summer camp carpool lane. So I just want to thank everybody for your commitment. We know it's there, but just seeing it in real time through the Zooms is really just incredibly striking. We see you, we are you, we appreciate you. So thank you so much. So I'm Annie Kennedy. I'm the Chief of Policy and Advocacy with the Every Life Foundation, and we're just thrilled to have everybody here joining us this week and next. And I'm also thrilled to be helping moderate this panel about the Benefit Act. We joke a lot that we like acronyms here in Washington, and this one is among one of my favorites for this bill. And I believe one of our panelists today, Sarah Lloyd Stevenson, was the person who came up with this acronym. And it's the Better Empowerment Now to Enhance Framework and Improve Treatments Act. Mouthful. So we're going to refer to it as the Benefit Act from here on out. And I'm just going to provide a little bit of context for this legislation, and then we'll move into a little bit of a deeper dive and you'll learn a lot about it. So just to pull back just a little bit, and why our DLA advisory committee and so many of our advocates helped prioritize this piece of legislation as one that we as a community would take to the Hill, is that just to remind all of us, and I think many of us have been in this space for quite some time, but for those who haven't, over the last decade, we have really experienced a paradigm shift in how patient communities, and especially the rare disease community, engages in the clinical trial ecosystem. So we are no longer considered just end users of the ecosystem, but we are really full partners in clinical trial design, in data collection, in regulatory review within the FDA, and very importantly are now really working to integrate patient experience data into informing decision-making within the access environment. So we've gone to being understood and appreciated as disease-specific experts and citizen scientists. And that's often referred to as this evolution of patient-focused drug development. And there have been many laws or many pieces of legislation that have been passed that have codified those concepts into law and into statute and have integrated patient experience data into that decision-making and into the frameworks that inform how clinical trials, how regulatory decisions are made, and now how access decisions are made. And that hasn't happened accidentally. That doesn't happen just because regulators say, hey, we think it would be a great idea if patients were at the table. It happens because patient communities demand it. It happens because we as communities say, we belong at the table and our experience is data, and it can be measured and it can be qualified and it can be quantified and it belongs there. And this is where we think it belongs specifically. And so there have been some communities in particular that have really helped drive and pave the way for us. And so today we will hear from, and there are many communities that have done that, but one in particular is the Duchenne community that has done a lot of that work and has done it not just for the Duchenne community in particular, but has done it for the broader rare disease community. Because as we know, and the reason we are all here together is because what we experience as one community is not specific just to the one community, but it applies to our broader rare disease community as partners. And we can all benefit, pardon the pun, from the advances that we move forward. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Benefit Act today. and to explain what the Benefit Act is and to provide the context for why the Benefit Act is important and what got us to this point. I'm really pleased if we can do the next slide to introduce our panel. And I'm going to give a little more context for each panelist as they each speak. So first is Ryan Fisher, and he is the chief advocacy officer with Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. And I'm thrilled to say all of these panelists are actually very close friends and colleagues of mine. And Ryan and I actually used to be very close colleagues when I was at PPMD. And so I'm thrilled to see him recap some of the great work that we were able to lead together at PPMD. And Ryan's going to take us through and talk about some of the work that went before Benefit and why that evolution of that work has led to the need for Benefit. And then we're going to hear from Sarah Lloyd-Stevenson, who I'll introduce when we get to her. And then my amazing friend, Buddy Cassidy, who's going to provide some context from Benefit through the lens of the patient community perspective, and also as someone who has served as an FDA patient representative and somebody who sat on an advisory committee for a product review at the FDA. So first, next slide, we'll go to Brian. So Brian, it's all you.
Thank you, Annie. It's lovely to be here. It's sort of like a family reunion. I want to thank all the advocates on the line. We're really grateful to you all for participating in your meetings. And today we want to get you prepared for the Benefit Act. And we're excited to talk about this piece of legislation that really has been an evolutionary need since the start of PFDD. So I think what's important to remember as you go to your Hill meetings about this bill is at the end of the day, this bill is about FDA transparency in their decision-making, okay? It's aimed at providing all stakeholders within our ecosystem with more information about how the FDA incorporates the patient experience data, so it's coined, or the patient voice, into deciding whether or not to approve a new therapy. So before we get into sort of the meat of the legislation, I want to talk a bit about FDA and its functions as a federal agency. You can go to the next slide, because it's important to know as this bill is aimed at FDA, a bit about the history and how we got to where we are with how the FDA operates. So they sit under the executive branch, which you're probably all aware of. And their mission is to quite simply protect the public from unsafe events when it comes to food, medications, medical devices, promote public health. Obviously, this plays a key role with the advancing of drug development and approving or denying drugs. And then following the laws and rules and regulations set forth by Congress through you, through the people. And this last piece is really where patient advocacy and the patient voice has played such a pivotal role in how they operate. You can go to the next slide. So just some history about the FDA and some tipping points that really help to create how the agency operates. It's important to remember the FDA's powers and authorities have really increased or changed following major crises in public health and public outcry. It was formed actually in 1906 by an act of Congress following the learnings of shockingly unsanitary conditions at Chicago stockyards, which was brought to light by a very famous novel by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle. Soon after the publication, this was actually an outraged President Theodore Roosevelt was really eager to sign a bill establishing this agency to protect consumers and the public. Following that, FDA's authority really was further enhanced in 1938, and this happened after an elixir was improperly prepared and caused mass poisoning in the US in 1937. It caused the death of more than 100 people. So that brought about the need, after a lot of public advocacy, for the FDA to have more powers over drug safety. And then 1962, famously, a drug called thalidomide. In this case, the FDA actually made the right call in rejecting the approval of this sedative that was used to treat morning sickness in pregnant women. Later was found to cause birth defects in Europe, Canada, and other countries. The FDA wanted more safety data, and this actually proved that the FDA needed powers to ensure drug makers were proving that drugs were both safe but also efficacious. So you can go to the next slide, because now this is probably a much more more recent tipping point that everyone's aware of, and that is the history of what happened with the HIV/AIDS crisis, which shed light on the issues related to FDA capacity to review medications in a timely manner. Activists, advocates really spent years voicing their outrage about the slow pace of getting these medications to patients. And with that, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act was born, along with the accelerated approval pathway to get drugs to patients much quicker. And the Prescription Drug User Fee Act was passed by Congress in 1992. Essentially, it allows FDA to collect these fees from drug manufacturers to fund the new drug approval process. And those fees came with requirements for what they call performance goals, to set target completion times, but it really provides a huge part of FDA's budget. It would not replace the budget from taxpayer money, but supplement. And I think at this point, it's nearly 50% of the budget, if someone can correct me. The law is still active today, and it's must-pass legislation. It's renewed every 5 years. We are currently in the 6th authorization of PDUFA, and it has been a vehicle for patient advocacy to work with Congress on the needs and priorities for patients. And over time, there have been additional tipping points that have created change, but it really was in 2012 that a watershed moment occurred for rare disease and patient engagement in drug development. And that was passage of PDUFA 5. This is also known as the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act. We love our acronyms in Washington, more commonly known as FDASIA. So you can go to the next slide. So this was really an incredible moment for rare disease, thanks to the work of so many on the line, including PPMD partnered with the Every Life Foundation and other rare disease organizations. This bill was passed under the PDUFA 5 and really serves as a game changer for the patient voice in drug development. We were successful in working together to advocate for specific rare disease provisions within the bill as well. The final legislation, as you see on your screen, included wins for rare disease, including expansion of accelerated approval into rare disease. At the time, it was being used a lot in HIV and cancer, but the bill codified that use in rare disease. Other major wins, Congress mandating the view that patients need to be incorporated into the process of decision-making. So patients' voice and data needed to be better integrated into FDA regulatory process, and that those performing what's called benefit risk assessments at FDA has to take a much more structured and transparent approach to incorporating these perspectives into their assessment. So I know that's a lot of language, but we'll dig into this a bit. And of course, this birthed patient-focused drug development out of the FDA, that program. I think everyone's aware FDA has been conducting meetings called PFDD meetings over time. Voice of the patient reports have been produced, as well as listening sessions have been conducted. And then a final key piece, we mentioned that benefit risk assessment. Well, now the FDA needed to make public, through this structured benefit risk assessment, how they weighed the benefits and risks and condition against the condition they were reviewing, and make that transparent. So there you see, and we'll get to this a little later, that framework that would be public for everybody after a drug was approved. You can go to the next slide. So when FDASIA passed, our community, along with many in the rare disease community, quickly began to innovate ways to engaging FDA and providing them data and working with drug companies in a much more intentional fashion. We ourselves held many face-to-face meetings with FDA. We also had, for the very first time, a patient serve on an FDA advisory committee. We're lucky to have Buddy Cassidy here with us today on the panel who will reflect on that. We've provided them with white papers. We wrote the first patient-initiated draft guidance for FDA, and that model's been used in other conditions. Like many of you, we expanded our patient registry. And then in an effort to quantify the patient voice, we did a series of what's called patient preference studies. That's collecting data on how patients and caregivers view benefit and risk and uncertainty for emerging therapies and quantifying the patient voice. Much of this data is termed now patient experience data, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides from now, but it has been very important to the work of not only FDA, but drug developers so they can improve how they're actually developing the therapies for the patients that they're serving. So you can go to the next slide. This is where the animations get crazy, so my apologies to the EveryLife team. So with all this data being produced, questions still remained. Questions like, was the FDA actually looking at this new data we were all submitting and developing? Were they weighing this information in that benefit risk decision-making framework? Was it reaching the right people? And then in 2015, a new legislative vehicle outside of the PDUFA structure presented itself as an opportunity to further PFDD. And ever since PDUFA 5, we had a lot of work being done, but this new vehicle provided us with an option to weigh in on what more could be done. The bill was called, as you all are well aware of, and advocated for 21st Century Cures Act. PPMD began working with our congressional champions. Sarah Lloyd-Stevenson on our panel was with Senator Wicker at the time. We also worked with Senator Klobuchar together to craft a new piece of legislation called the Patient-Focused Impact Assessment Act. Okay. This bill was focused on transparency of FDA, requiring them to develop a tool of sorts, a feedback loop, to tell us whether or not FDA reviewers had access at the time of review to patient-focused drug development data. So if we were all investing in collecting this data, at the end of the day, we wanted to know, was it reaching the right people? So this bill was worked on. It went through the Senate, and it also asked for the FDA to issue a series of guidance documents regarding the collection of this data. So we wanted to know what were best practices, what did FDA view as the best ways to collect the data, the best ways to ask the questions. We needed guidance from them. So we were thrilled that the bill passed the Senate, and ultimately we were extremely pleased. PFA was included in the final package of cures. And that legislation also included funding for NIH, FDA to oversee the new programs. Important to note that another PDUFA was passed in 2017, PDUFA 6, and there were additional PFDD provisions that further strengthened the work around the PFDD, in this case in PDUFA 6, around real world evidence and the development of drug development tools, including PROs. So let's go to the next slide. So what does it look like? On your left, you actually see what the statement of patient experience, the checklist, looks like in an application. You see different areas or types of patient experience data that the FDA has to indicate if they actually had access to this information at the time of review. And then on the right, you see the guidance documents currently in development. I think guidance 2 is actually completed, so I apologize that might be a bit out of date. But I think everyone should be aware of this checklist and what's on it, and what it means. So it's a pretty, when we think about patient experience data, I don't think it gives you much information. So let's talk about how the FDA looks at patient experience data. It's a little broad in its definition because I don't think they wanted to really limit what companies and patient groups and patients themselves could do, but broadly defined as data collected with the intention to provide information about patient experiences with diseases or conditions, including the impact of the disease or condition related to a therapy or clinical investigation, and patient preferences with respect to treatment of the disease or the condition. So the impact that the condition has on patients during their day-to-day lives, their experience with current treatment options, and how patients weigh the risks and benefits of treatments available to them. So as I said, pretty expansive in the definition, and data can come from a variety of sources. And those guidances you see are meant to provide more direction on how to collect that data. So we can go to the next slide, because I do want to take a moment to look at this statement of patient experience data and break it down a bit, because this data can come from both the patient experience of those who are in a clinical trial, or it can come from those living with the condition outside the trial. So let's walk through some of these. There at the top, you see the FDA has put in the chart clinical outcome assessments. So this is more than likely data specific to the patients who are within the trial that this application is about. And that can be related to patient-reported outcomes. I think everyone knows PROs lend clinical meaning to changes in, for instance, functional ability. So it is important. One of the caveats here is you need to have a PRO that's validated in your condition. And we know that's a limiting step. That's a whole other conversation, but this is an area that they believe to be very important for patient experience data. And then there's clinician-reported outcomes as well, as that is viewed. The observer-reported outcomes that are in the middle, that's usually by a caregiver. Not limited to caregivers, but just to give you a little definition. The next one you see in light blue that the FDA considers on the checklist is qualitative studies. I think you all have participated in these. These can take the form of focus groups or interviews. This data can be collected both within a trial or outside the trial about patients who are not on an experimental therapy. The next one in red, data from patient-focused drug development meetings. So the externally led meetings or the voice of the patient meetings or other forms of PFDD interactions can be considered within the statement of patient experience. Then there's observational studies and natural history studies. You're seeing this is a very broad definition of patient experience. And then following that, data on patient preference studies. Once again, can be data on people in the trial or outside the trial. Patient preference studies can provide you with numbers about how patients think and feel about things like benefit and risk and uncertainty, a mode of administration, say an IV versus a pill. It can talk about what symptoms are most important to treat. So a whole array of things patient preference studies can include. And then that final one, I think there's one more, they leave a sort of a catch-all of patient experience data on the bottom there if you want to do one more animation. Patient experience data that was not submitted in the application but was considered in the review is that last one. I don't think the animation showed, but that's okay. Okay, so that was a lot, I know, but I really feel like we throw around these terms and it's important for you to understand what FDA's, what they feel to be patient experience data, because then this could help you if you're working with a drug company or you're in a patient advocacy organization, but the types of data that might be important for you to invest in, collect, and work on to ensure you have it for these new drug applications. So I think we can go to the next slide. So now with the checklist, we have clarity on whether or not regulators have access to this data, which is great. It was a very important step, but we feel that a critical gap still exists. And that gap is, how is FDA actually incorporating this data into their decision-making? And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my friend Sarah Lloyd, who's going to talk about the legislative fix we hope to achieve to fill this gap. Sarah Lloyd?
That was awesome, Ryan. I'm going to do a quick intro of Sarah Lloyd. First of all, thank you, Ryan, for that. Just a couple things about the first is I just want to make sure advocates who've been with us previously, I just want to underscore something Ryan said. So Patient-Focused Impact Assessment Act, or that Patient Experience Data Checklist that Ryan just did a really beautiful job going through in some detail, was the basis for the patient experience data section of 21st Century Cures. So that is something that many people here made possible. And so there's just something, tonight when you go to bed and you're not sure whether everything we do makes a difference, everything you do does make a difference. So that has already been something that we have achieved as a community. So feel good about that. The other thing is Ryan referenced a lot of the guidances that have come out of FDA, and there are many of them. And again, that came from 21st Century Cures and also the last PDUFA cycle. And again, that's something that we requested as a community, that we want FDA to tell us what their current thinking is on the integration of patient experience data into clinical trial decision-making. So again, that's another thing that we should feel really good about. The question we have, though, is what of that applies directly to rare disease? Because those guidances are very general to broad therapeutic development and are not specific to rare disease. So I just want to flag that Every Life is leading an effort with many patient advocacy partners, with many industry partners, and an effort that's being co-sponsored with National Health Council, Bio and Pharma, to assess those guidances, understand how they apply to rare disease, and we'll be publishing a compendium and leading a webinar for the community so that we can really assess that, and then working with FDA to look at how we improve upon that for rare diseases. So I just wanted to flag those things. And so now the good news is you don't have to be an expert in everything Ryan just shared. So we wanted everyone to have context, and there are many here today who are experts and want that deep dive. But when you go to the Hill and talk about benefit, we wanted to make sure you could distill it down. So for that, we have Sarah Lloyd-Stevenson, who many of you met yesterday when we talked about preparing for Hill meetings. And Sarah Lloyd, as Ryan said, has been a champion and a friend of our rare disease community for many years. We first met her when she was in Senator Wicker's office. And as you know, many of you, that Senator Wicker is one of the co-chairs of our Congressional Rare Disease Caucus. For those in the neuromuscular community, Sarah Lloyd has been one of the people that helped drive the reauth and the amendments of the MD Care Act and PFIA that we just talked about. She helped us also craft the legislation for STAT and is helping drive that for us. And then also is working hard on benefits. So she is quite an ardent, unwavering champion for our community. And I'm gonna hand it over to Sarah Lloyd, who's gonna take us through what you need to know for benefits next week.
Thank you so much, Annie, and thank you, Ryan. I feel like I always learn something when I hear Ryan go through all of that, because even when you're working in the policy space on a daily basis, thinking about these pieces of legislation, it's really helpful to remember, what do we mean when we talk about patient experience data? And I will note before I start talking about benefits that as you're having these conversations with staff, if you have an engaged staff person in the meeting who has a question like, whoa, what are you talking about when you say PFDD? That's a great opportunity for a follow-up. Just do a screen grab of that slide. I'm sure we can share those with you guys and share that slide that Ryan had, because I think that's exceptionally helpful. That being said, so you've been hearing this very fun acronym for a bit now. Benefit is the logical next step. The very important thing to think about here is you just heard a pretty amazing history from Ryan on how far we've come in under a decade as far as how the FDA considers patient experience data in the drug approval process and how Congress has gotten involved in that. I think an important thing to note, and I'll note this toward the end and kind of my remember these 3 points wrap up, that there has been a lot of momentum. And when we say a logical next step, we say that because so much has changed in the last decade that we've taken these big steps very thoughtfully over the last several pieces of legislation. And now this is where we're seeing, okay, this is what we now recognize needs to be done. So just a little context as far as why benefit, why now? On the why now piece, I promise I'll get into the policy. I want to talk a little as well about why 2021 and 2022 will be so important for enacting benefit. This legislation was introduced originally back in 2017, immediately following the 2016 passage of the 21st Century Cures Act, which, as Annie and Ryan noted, had that very important PFI language. At that time, benefit actually passed the US Senate, and that was a great thing and a lot of good momentum for us. However, we did get a little pushback at the time saying, you know what, this is really good policy, but 21st Century Cures Act just passed. Let's take a breather, pump the brakes, take a breather. Let's see how PFIA, the section in cures, is enacted and implemented, and let's see what we truly need. Turns out the community was right, and benefit truly was the right policy, but it just wasn't quite the time then, even though the US Senate on a bipartisan basis unanimously approved it. So that's where we are now. We obviously have been through a lot in recent years, and we have recognized more than ever how important filling this existing gap is going to be. So we get through 2017, 2018, obviously within the last Congress, COVID has disrupted a lot, but now we are ready in 2021 to hit the ground running with our champions in both the Senate and the House, which I'll get to in just a moment. An important thing to note as well is, again, should this come up in your conversations, Ryan explained to you a little bit about the PDUFA process. I think it may have been last night that Jamie Sullivan was going a little deep dive into what PDUFA does. As Ryan noted, we're about to be in the throes of a new PDUFA reauthorization next year. So should it come up, or should you have the opportunity to raise kind of how we could envision benefit becoming law, it makes perfect sense that should it not be enacted by the end of this year, that it should be part of that PDUFA package in 2022. Okay, there's my legislative landscape update, and I will talk a little bit about the actual policy. So, nope, go back. Sorry, go back a couple, please. There we go, thank you. So this is an important thing. When Ryan was talking about PFIA, we're talking about what's the next logical step here. The PFIA Act, I like to think that a little bit of the pre-approval and the post-approval for patient experience data. It said, let's help explain and help patients understand the process through which they can submit information to the FDA. That's the pre-process, right? And then it also included a requirement that the secretary, or rather FDA, of course, issue a brief statement following the drug approval process on what data was submitted and how it was used. And that's again, that pre-piece and that post-piece. What I'm interested in is what happens in between there. How does the FDA actually look at this data during the drug approval process? That's where the rubber hits the road, and that's what really matters for patients who are spending time collecting this information and submitting it into the FDA. So that's where the risk-benefit assessment comes up, or benefit risk assessment and framework really is an important thing. FDA calls this the foundation of their regulatory process. When you think about the BR framework in the summary, that is how the FDA is considering the safety, the efficacy of a drug, and how they capture it in this little matrix that you see here. I love this slide. I have to say, this is Ryan's. He does all the wizardry here on the slides and graphics, but this is one that I think just speaks to me because it makes you actually visualize what we're talking about as far as a change with benefit. The way that benefit changes the law, the current statute, is it says in that part of the code that was originally amended by the previous laws about which Ryan spoke, it says that actually FDA needs to look at this specifically during the benefit risk assessment. Again, that foundational piece of FDA, that's when this needs to be actually considered. Not necessarily before, not after, as part of the drug approval process. So that's very important. That's where I talk about that middle piece, not just the how do you get the information and a brief statement about the information. It's actually ensuring that the information, that the data is used during that drug approval process in the middle. Further, Ryan spoke a good bit about how is the data truly being used. When we say how is it truly being used, the way that 21st Century Cures contemplated this was a brief statement, which can be very helpful. But benefit then gets into that part of the code and says, okay, that brief statement should include explicitly how the reviewers considered or maybe didn't consider specific patient experience data in the benefit risk assessment. So this is where when you see the proposed change, this is what you see post-approval of how things were measured up essentially during the approval process. So here we have a statement of patient experience data and how it was used. This will be hugely impactful, not just for patients to understand how their data and again, how that effort is really paying off, but also for us to make sure that the right people are looking at the right information at the right time. And that's key. An important note, many of you may have seen if you're following this issue that excuse me, FDA released a report recently going through the patient experience data processes. And I want to note that they flagged in their own report that there's some inconsistency about how this data is used depending on the review division. Further, there's significant lack of how patients then understand how it's used. And they admitted this. This is FDA saying, recognizing this, which I think is helpful for us to say that this new matrix, this new process, and this new transparency piece, when applied across all review divisions at FDA, not just the few who maybe have worked really well with, for example, the Duchenne community, when all of them are doing this, it truly can end to better results for patients and the agency in itself. One small note there that should this come up in your conversations, because Of course, as you're talking to the Hill, you're going to be advocating on behalf of rare disease. You'll be talking about the STAT Act, perhaps, which is very rare disease specific, the Rare Disease Caucus. An important distinction about benefit is that this is not only not disease specific, it is an even disease group specific. This is something that can help every patient impacted by any number of diseases or issues, rare or otherwise. So, for example, Alzheimer's groups have endorsed this because they see the benefit, no pun intended, excuse me, of having this data and having this transparency and ensuring that their voice is heard actually during, again, I'll keep saying the rubber meets the road, but during that actual approval process. So let's move on to the next slide, please. And this is the exciting thing, and this is where I kind of want to do a drum roll, please, for everyone. I told Ryan this morning, I said, happy benefit day. Very exciting, as you all know, and as Annie mentioned earlier, my former boss, Senator Wicker, and Senator Klobuchar in the Senate introduced benefit earlier this year. Of course, it had passed the Senate previously in 2017, so we know that we have great support in the Senate and great champions there. What is exciting about today is our newly identified House champions, Representative Doris Matsui, a Democrat from California, and Brad Winstrup, a Republican from Ohio, introduced benefit in the House today. So as you go to the Hill next week to talk to your members of Congress, to their staff, this is an exciting thing that we actually now have a House introduced bill, and we're really hoping to get this done before y'all storm the House next week, digitally, of course. So excited to share that. Hopefully we will have a bill number for you to reference in the House next week. We should be getting that by end of day today or Monday, and we'll try to update advocates as you're going to those conversations. A couple notes about these champions. Of course, Klobuchar and Wicker are our co-chairs for the Rare Disease Caucus in the Senate. They are also sponsors of the STAT Act. So they're ones, if you end up meeting with them, seeing their staff, whatever, tell them thank you. They do a lot for this community. They are both passionate about it and have done just for decades, honestly. We've mentioned empty care. Both of them have worked in that in the past as well. And the House, similarly, Doris Matsui has been a huge advocate for Duchenne issues for years. This is how she was identified here. She helps the appropriations process. And very importantly, she is a very well-respected senior member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. That committee, of course, holds jurisdiction over most all healthcare programs, including FDA. So we're really excited to have her champion. And on the Winstrup front, it's really been an honor and a pleasure getting to work with his staff in recent weeks to talk as we were preparing for this introduction. He is a Republican and the co-chair of the House DOT Caucus, the Doctors Caucus. You don't need to remember all of this, but I note that just so that you're thinking about who our champions are, we really have some strong members of Congress here helping us out. And Winstrup, the reason it matters that he is a member of the Doctors Caucus, the DOT Caucus, is because when you're thinking about GOP or Republican health policy in the House, you kind of want to pass the DOT Caucus test, I'll say. The individuals on that caucus are very influential as to how health policy progresses from the Republican side in the House of Representatives. So there are champions, two bills, well, one bill, two chambers, very excited about it. And let's go on to that final slide. This is where I said at the outset here, you may not have to listen to everything I say, but I'll have a few takeaways for you on my final slide, please. There we go. First and foremost, and I want to extend this first bullet just a little bit, it is when you're talking to members of Congress or their staff about benefit, and if you take nothing away from our conversation today, I hope that you have the opportunity to express to them how important the patient voice is for the approval process of drugs and therapies at the FDA, period. That is the goal here. That is the end goal. That is what benefit will help accomplish. And I want to expand it a little bit based off of what Annie said, because she is so right that the patient voice does not only matter at FDA, but it matters on Capitol Hill. So when you are talking to your member of Congress, they are listening. Even if you think that staffer may be distracted or working on other things, your voice matters here, not just to get the legislation through, but ultimately in the drug approval process. The other two quick things I would note, should you remember anything from this conversation from my perspective, from what I've shared with you, is the Benefit Act is bipartisan. And I know I've said this a lot to many of you. You're probably thinking, Sarah Lloyd, you sound like a broken record, but it is important today in today's political environment, there are a lot of partisan things out there, and it can be pretty exhausting, especially for staff who are dealing with partisan, highly politicized issues on a daily basis. It is very important to the rare disease community and very helpful to us that our issues are bipartisan. You are not going to find someone along party lines necessarily say that they won't support something. So that's an important thing to note, to keep in mind, but also to share with staff, should they say, when they ask, well, who's introduced this bill? When you tell them Doris Matsui and Brad Winstrup, they may think, boy, I didn't know those two agreed on anything. Yes, they do, and it's benefit, and your boss should agree with it too. The third point, of course, and I think Ryan and I both have been echoing this, that the Benefit Act builds off of past actions and laws that Congress has taken, as well as current FDA priorities. I mentioned that FDA document from a few weeks ago. They talk about the importance of PFDD and patient experience data. We hear it all the time. We know that this is the direction things are going and the direction that things need to go based on where we've been over the past decade. So that's an exciting just thing to think about as you make the case for the Benefit Act to be the logical and simple next step. So with that, you have got a very important voice to hear from. So I am going to zip it for a little while, and I just so appreciate y'all having me today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah Lloyd. So one of the questions that came in was whether or not the slides are available, because there's been just such great content. So I just wanted to let everyone know that the slides should be on the platform if you go to resources on the platform. So if you want to download any of the slides or want any of these just for either your own edifice or for your Hill meetings. So we're just gonna spend the last few minutes listening to, very importantly, the patient community perspective. And so I'm pleased to introduce Buddy Cassidy. Buddy is a PhD candidate finishing his thesis at the University of California, Irvine, and also has served as an FDA patient representative as a part of FDA's patient representative program, and as a part of that program served on an advisory committee for a product review. Ryan had mentioned that he was the first patient representative on an advisory committee. Just to clarify, he wasn't the first patient representative. There have certainly been patient representatives on advisory committees. He was the first person to serve on an advisory committee where, as a community, we made the case that there should be 2 patient representatives on the advisory committee, because Buddy is a part of the Duchenne muscular dystrophy community, which is a traditionally thought of as a pediatric onset condition, but he's an adult living with Duchenne. So the patient representative who traditionally is a part of that advisory committee was a parent who certainly was an effective representative, but in cases where there's a pediatric onset disorder, as a community, we had made the case that there should also be a young adult or an adult serving on the advisory committee, so that there are instances in which there should be 2 distinct patient representatives on the advisory committee, which, after hearing from the community, FDA agreed. So Buddy was the first to serve as the second patient representative on an AdCom. And he also serves as a member of PPMD's Adult Advisory Committee. So Buddy, we'd love to hear your perspective on why the integration of patient experience data is so important, and why in particular benefit is a logical and important next step. So thanks, Buddy.
Okay, so before we get started, I know I just wanted to review a couple of things from Ryan's presentation. I remember I saw a presentation like that 6-7 years ago, maybe a little longer, and I was like, oh my gosh, all those acronyms. So the way I remember it is, so I'm going to sing a song for you guys, so everybody knows Beach Boys, Kokomo, right? So the way I think of it is PDUFA, PDASIA, ooh, I want to take you to the FIA. So I'm going to leave it there. So PDUFA, PDASIA, and FIA. PDUFA, it's just user fees on the part of the companies, the pharmaceutical companies. They pay a fee to the FDA, and this is to help get things approved faster, so they can devote more resources to looking at the drug. And this, this is established with PDUFA. the first one. And this is in the consequence of the AIDS activists like ACT UP pushed the FDA for more transparency and quicker approval of drugs. And so what it creates is it creates a public advisory committee. The public advisory committee has all kinds of experts. In my case, me, the patient representative. They'll have somebody looking at the trial design, maybe a cardiologist, a general practitioner, somebody looking at the pharmacology. So everybody has something to bear in terms of their particular area of expertise. FDASIA, that's PDUFA 5. That means more bringing the patient perspective in more when evaluating the safety and efficacy of the drugs. And so that means that various groups, PPMD included, are sending patient data to the FDA. But at that point with PDUFA 5, where is all this patient data going? We don't really know. It's going into maybe a black hole. So then that's when we got to FIA. FIA is sort of resolving the black hole problem. The idea there is it's that way the FDA has to indicate that they have access to this patient data, and patient preference data, and they have a checklist indicating that they have received it. So at that point, we know it's not going into a black hole. We know they've got it, okay? But the question is, and what are we trying to do with the Benefit Act? How do we make sure they look at it? So make sure they look at it. What are they doing with it? How are the different categories like patient reported and observer outcomes versus clinician reported outcomes versus natural history studies? So not like, are we not asking if the FDA is looking at them, but in what capacity? What do they maybe pay special attention to? What do they weigh particularly heavily? And this in turn makes it easier for patient advocacy groups to figure out, okay, what should we be submitting when a new drug is up for approval? So it helps us figure out as rare disease advocates, what should we be collecting? What role does it play in the process? That's what the Benefit Act is trying to do. Now, had the Benefit Act been in place when I was at the advisory committee, things might have gone potentially in a potentially different way. So let me explain what I mean by that. So I will say that the benefit risk assessment chart was not filled out. It was not complete. Neither I nor anyone else on the advisory committee received the benefit risk assessment. So that is problematic. And in looking through the new drug application, as the patient representative, I took it on myself to strongly consider the risk benefits, looking at the severe adverse effects. So in some ways then it was a problem that I personally, as a patient rep, had to scour the appendices and look at the pharma mechanics, which, if you remember, my background is English literature. So it was a struggle. I got out some old college textbooks. So I was looking at the SREs, and so the SREs SAEs are severe adverse effects. And they were not good. They were really awful. So just to sort of like a hypothetical, right? If the drug worked, and it worked fantastically, not this particular drug, but if it worked, you had Duchenne, it got you walking again, but it maybe meant you were on you had like terrible diarrhea and were on the toilet for like 6 hours a day, right? And in that case, it would be good to have patient data and the benefit risk assessment. That in that case, the trade-off may well be worthwhile according to the patient community. In this case, unfortunately, the SAEs were very bad, mortally damaging liver, kidneys, and other body systems. But so it was causing problems far worse, in my estimate, than Duchenne actually would. But in terms of making that decision, I admit I was poking around in the dark. I had to make my best assessment. The first time that I got to hear anything about patient experience was during the advisory committee meeting itself, when various patients and caregivers and their families and clinicians are able to testify. So that was the first time I heard it.
Hey, buddy, I'm sorry,
yes.
and I'm sorry, we'll probably have to do a webinar on this topic based on all the questions coming in the chat, but we have just about like 30 seconds or a minute left. So if you could just, and you're doing a really great job kind of putting this all in context, because we've given a lot of information today, but maybe talk about how maybe integration into the benefit risk framework would have enhanced your experience specifically.
Okay, so if they could fill out, we want the FDA to fill out the benefit risk assessment, and we want the patient perspective in there in terms of how to weigh things. Because the experts on the advisory committee are experts in their field, not the disease in question. And so when they're thinking benefit risk, they contextualize it for themselves in terms of the average person. But if the patient assessment of benefit risk is there, it tells them the degree to which patients with the disease are willing to tolerate various risks and reactions.
That was an amazing synopsis. I also have to tell you, I'm sure you can't be following the chat. Your song at the beginning, I think, is the highlight of the Rare Disease Week Legislative Conference for most days. So you did a great job making all these concepts very tangible for everybody. Thank you very much.
And I'm happy to talk further about my experience, or if you have any questions. So I will just put my email in the chat if that's okay.
Yeah.
Is that all right, Annie?
Yeah, drop it in. So I know there were questions we weren't able to get to, and we are over time, so I'm getting the hook from our organizers. And there seems to be so much interest in this that we will consider putting together some RDLA tip sheets and resources, and maybe even a webinar for the community on this topic, because this clearly is a topic that would really help empower a lot of the advocacy and the work that we all do. But I just want to take a moment to thank Brian and Sarah Lloyd and Buddy for being a part of this panel with us, and most especially to all who participated and all the advocates who will be going to the Hill to help us move this priority forward to make sure that we continue the momentum to ensure that patient experience data is fully integrated into informing the decision-making of our regulators, the FDA. So thank you everybody for being a part of this, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks everyone.